Welcome back to Pace Immigration, paceimmigration.com, talking with U.S. and Canadian immigration lawyer Michael O'Rourke. Michael, how's it going?
Pretty good, Sean. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. We've got the United States E-1 Treaty Trader Visa. You are really a big fan of this one, and for good reason. I think it's a straightforward way for people to live and work in the United States. So I've got up here on the screen what it is. Michael, would you care to explain it?
Sure. So there are two different visas for some nationalities where they're creatures of the State Department. So the E-1 is based solely on your international trade, where the E-2 is based on investment in the U.S. We're only going to talk about the E-1, and the subset of countries that have E-1 type of treaties with the U.S. is much smaller than countries with E-2.
Right. I was going to say people can visit, they can simply Google E-1 treaty trader countries or E-1 countries even, and they'll get the full list.
Exactly.
Okay, so here we have the E-1 non-immigrant classification allows a national of a treaty country, one of those countries we just talked about, to be admitted to the United States to solely to engage in international trade on their own behalf. What does that mean, Michael?
So as an E-1, you are able to come in and work and live in the U.S. in order to direct and continue your trading relationship with the United States. There are a couple of requirements as to what that relationship has to look like, but it is very flexible and it is not as intensely, how do I say this? It's not intensely scrutinized, because it is, of course, scrutinized, but it doesn't have as many moving parts and isn't as difficult to get up and running as, say, an E-2 visa.
Right. Here we have qualifications for it. So one of those qualifications we'd already touched upon, that you have to be from one of those treaty trader countries. You have to, so a national of a treaty trader country. But I wanted to highlight this one, Michael. This is at the top of the page when you visit the government's website on E-1. They want to make sure you're aware of this. Go into this citizenship through investment stuff.
Sure. So citizenship through investment. In some places in the world, you can buy a passport through investment in real estate or donation to a country's sovereign national fund, things like that. Grenada used to be, and still does maintain, an E-2 treaty with the U.S., and many people had invested in Grenada citizenship and then applied for E-2 benefits. But a couple of years ago, the U.S. government started clamping down on that. Now, if you are going to purchase a passport, so you're investing for citizenship in one of these countries that has a program like this, you have to actually reside in that country for 3 years before you can take advantage of the e-visa.
Okay, and we have here, this is the crux of the matter, is the trade. They're let you live and work in the United States unless you're committing substantial trade, as they put it. Go into that a bit.
Well, substantial is whatever you call it, honestly, Sean. So substantial has to be more than one trading relationship, so more than one customer in the U.S. It has to be ongoing and continuous. And just a quick note about national of a treaty trader country. Not only do you have to be a national of that country, but your company does as well. So say I'm a Canadian, and Canada does have an E-1 treaty trader relationship with the U.S. If I have a company where I own less than 50%, and say I own it with somebody from Australia, for instance, and they own the majority, then my company is not going to be Canadian. The ownership of the company determines the nationality of the company. So you have to have both your own nationality and the company nationality being of the treaty country.
Right, and we have here principal trade. I take that to mean that basically the United States or people in the United States have to be your best customers.
Exactly. So you have to have at least 50% of your international trading relationships with the United States.
Okay, let's carry on then. So let's say all that's in order. People might be asking, well, what am I trading? I run a company. I have a company. I have some customers in the States, and it's actually kind of interesting how, like you were saying at the beginning, it is scrutinized, but there is a lot of leeway here, including in what you're trading.
Exactly. So it could be traditional goods, it could be services. I've had companies that are suit sales and manufacturing companies that based in Windsor, Ontario, that trade a lot with the American Midwest, and they were able to get an E-1 visa for their executives. I had an astrologer who had a sole proprietorship, and based on his trade with the United States, he was able to get an E-1 visa because most of his clients were in the US, and he had systematic continued trade with the US. It really can be almost any type of business because as long as it meets the definition of trade and you are providing goods or services, let's talk. Let's see if what your business looks like and how your business functions actually would fit into the treaty.
I was going to say, I mean, it's worth giving you a call. If you have customers in the United States and you do wish to live and work in the US, give Michael a call because let's face it, an astrologer it's a pretty good move on your part by making sure that the US can recognize that as trade, which most people wouldn't even think of that.
Well, yeah, but he was selling his services to a number of companies that then took his content and placed it in their own journals and online resources, and he had customers who he provided services for directly in the US as well. So it really fit the definition. Something also that's important to know with the E-1, you don't have to make an investment in the US. I know I said that earlier, but you don't have to have an office in the US. You can if you want. You don't have to have a certain amount of money that you've invested in a US operation, unlike the E-2. So if you are of a treaty country and you do engage in international trade, and honestly many companies do engage in international trade whether they realize it or not, it could work for them.
It could be written in the stars, as it is with your astrologer. That's great
Well,
stuff.
I'll check with my client.
Good idea. Okay, so we've got that in order. You're from a country, treaty country with the United States for trade. You have a service and you've got more than 50% of your clientele is in the United States, so you're all good there. You want to go to the United States. One thing we should highlight, I think, it's still a non-immigrant visa, and go into how long it lasts and how long you have to renew it, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So, for instance, for a Canadian, you have to make an application to the U.S. consulate in Toronto. Once they reviewed all of your documents, they'll call you in for an interview. If they approve it, they'll give you a visa for 5 years. However, with that visa, every time you enter the U.S., you're given a 2-year period of stay. You can either go out and come back in and renew that 2-year period, or you can apply within the United States to extend your stay. But the e-visa is one of those visas where it's actually stamped in your passport with a visa foil. And that's similar to every other nationality. They get a visa based on the Department of State reciprocity table. So, for instance, some countries are 2 years, some are 4, some are 5. The majority are 5 for this type of visa, but you only get a 2-year entry each time.
Okay, but people that have been on E-1 forever, like for a
Yeah.
long time. It's not like, it's only 2 years and then you're done.
Yeah, it's great because every 5-year period, well, like for instance, Canadians, they have to renew every 5 years. There is no limit as long as the trade is going on and they're still making a profit. And so as long as they're meeting the requirements of the program, they can hang out in e-visa status in the US pretty much perpetually. The only drawback is that there is no good way to go directly from an e-visa like this to a green card. So we might look at other non-immigrant pathways that have dual intent. The E-1 and the E-2 only have single temporary intent, non-immigrant intent. Or we might look at the EB-5 later on if they do want to get that green card. But for many people, it works just well enough to stay on an e-visa and renew it as they want to stay in the U.S. or for however long they want to stay.
Excellent. I put it down at the bottom here. We covered this kind of, but I just wanted to highlight it because sometimes people might be wondering if it's a money thing, like how much money they're generating with these transactions. The monetary value of the trade isn't what's important. It's how much trade is.
Well, yeah, it has to be more than one. And it has to be ongoing. So if you have, say your pie is 100%, if say you have 10 customers and they make up a total of 60% of your 100% pie, I'm not a mathematician, but if you have at least a number of clients and you have that continuous systematic trade, then that's going to be looked on as substantial trade. But they don't look at the dollar value.
Interesting. Okay. Another question people might have, if they're a successful business person or they have a company or something, like they might be old enough to have a spouse and kids. So we have here family considerations. What happens with, and I know that the age matters when it comes to children and immigration. So we've got here spouses and children under 21, children over 21, and can they work?
So spouses get to work. It's considered inherent in an e-visa. So a spouse gets an E-2 dependent and they're allowed to work for any employer in the U.S. Children get an E-2 dependent, but they're not allowed to work. And children over 21, well, they're not considered children anymore. They're on their own. So if they're going to come to the U.S., they have to have their own means to get a visa, say for an F1 for studies or something on that order.
Okay. That's actually pretty big that the spouse can work, because a lot of times in immigration, that's the tripwire.
Yeah. So with many of the U.S. work visa categories, the E-1, the E-2, the L-2, they have the ability to work in the United States. Unfortunately, ones like the TN or the H-1Bs, dependent the H-4, well, they get to work, but it's a long, involved process, and it only kicks in later on. But the E's and the L's have the best work authorization for spouses.
Okay. Everybody loves the E's and the L's. I like it. Michael O'Rourke, United States E-1 Treaty Trader Visa. Contact him for more information and to get started on your pathway to living and working in the United States. Michael, thanks for this. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks so much, Sean. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.